Welcome to The Forgotten Soldier by Guy Sajer, a gripping and deeply personal story of a young soldier caught up in the chaos of the Eastern Front. These are his words. Let's begin. At the first light of dawn after our radio message had reached headquarters, a Dornier 217 flew over, releasing a smoke signal. This told us that our 3 motorized companies should proceed quickly to a key position at the front to the north of us. We were ordered to destroy our base and most of the village. Nothing should be left which would aid or shelter the enemy. As we had no incendiary material, we limited ourselves to burning the thatched roofs of the cottages. Then our motorized company left on foot with our material loaded into the 4 ancient trucks we had left. The radio truck and sidecar preceded them. Every 10 or 15 miles, the trucks and sidecar stopped and waited for us. We would arrive at the front together, or not at all. Our orders made no sense. The officers issuing them seemed to be completely unaware of the actual condition of mobile units allegedly standing by. We were limited to doing the best we could. Food was our most difficult problem. For a long time now, we had received no supplies, and our meals were produced by some kind of magic. We became hunters and trappers and nest robbers and experimented with wild plants whose leaves looked like salad greens. After a long chase, we were sometimes able to catch an abandoned horse. But 800 men require substantial quantities of food, and every day we were faced with the same difficulties. Every day we called for help on the radio, and every day received the same reply. Supplies en route should have reached you. The Army Postal Service seemed to have vanished too. No letters or packages, no news of any kind. Despite the warm summer sun, which was now in fact somewhat too warm, the situation had become desperate. Yesterday's pig had been grilled and boiled and devoured the night before, along with 150 quarts of hot water, which we elevated to the status of pork bouillon. Today we were leaving for the front. Our eyes gleamed like the eyes of famished wolves. Our stomachs were empty, our mess tins were empty, and the horizon was devoid of any hope. Murderous sentiments lurked behind our eyes, which glittered with hunger. Hunger produces a curious frame of mind. It is impossible to imagine dying of hunger. For a long time now, we had been used to living on very little. Our stomachs digested substances which would kill a comfortable bourgeois citizen in a few weeks. No one had any spare fat left, no bellies or double chins, and our long muscles stood out in relief as though we'd been flayed. As our fast continued, our senses grew more acute. We looked like the bony animals with blazing eyes one might encounter in the desert. It would take days of marching and dust to extinguish that blaze. For the moment, despite the hollows in our bellies, everything still seemed possible. We would simply march until we found food. After all, Russia was not an empty desert. The immense prairie around us looked fertile, and we would surely come across a village we could ransack. Sperlovsky and Lenzen checked the map. There were a great many villages in our sector, therefore the situation wasn't too serious. The trouble was that our rectangle of paper represented an area as large as all of France. Between any 2 villages, there might be hundreds of absolutely empty miles. The smallest digression to reach one of the names on the map could mean several more days of marching. "There's nothing really to worry about," said Lenzen, who didn't like to concede defeat. "There are plenty of villages lost in the steppe which aren't marked on the map, and then there are the kolkhozes too." We had been ordered to march north. There could be no more delay. In any case, there was nothing left to eat where we were. Our long file set out, "Company! March! March!" Hour after hour, at 2 or 3 miles an hour, we tramped in growing desperation through the uncultivated prairie. "Somebody could make money farming here," remarked a Hanover country boy. There were large fields of wheat near each village. Beyond these, over spaces as broad as a French department, there was nothing but wild grass and gray or red dust and thick forest, much of which was probably virgin. We had grown used to great distances. Above all, we thought of them as possible battlefields. Other reactions still lay in the future for those who returned to their native countries. with their suffocating densities and horizons which seemed close enough to touch, always marked by commonplace structures of public utility, stones arranged in some dubious style. These men, who had grown used to stretches of ground as vast as the sky, no longer knew how to sit on grass which always belonged to someone. For us, at the moment, there was only limitless space, where our boots raised a cloud of multicolored dust that settled on everything that disturbed it. We belonged to the earth far more than it belonged to us. Except for the war, we felt a vast, limitless pleasure in our surroundings, in a kind of plenitude for which in later years we would always feel nostalgia. If only there had been something to eat. After our 11 o'clock break, our march began again. We had gulped down, like a dose of medicine, the cooked sprouts of young wheat which had been prepared 2 days earlier. As a last resort, we had some millet, cooked in water. The weather was very hot. Fortunately, our exceedingly light meals did not produce after-dinner somnolence. We drank the warm water from our water bottles with a certain apprehension. Running streams were quite widely spaced, and water from ponds carried the risk of malaria, typhoid, and other diseases, like cholera. To keep up our spirits, we sang as we marched, Ein Heller und ein Batzen. The words, like the tune, were carried into the emptiness by the light summer wind, losing all meaning, which no longer seemed strange to ears once accustomed to hearing them echo between the walls of flag-decked towns. Der Heller ward zu Wasser, der Batzen ward zu Wein. Not that we had any choice. There was no wine, and the water had to be drunk sparingly and with caution. Heidi, Heido, Haida, Heidi, Heido, Haida, Heidi, Heido, Haida, ah, 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 ah. Company, march, march. We marched, singing for no one but ourselves, and all of us already knew the tune. Then it grew dark. Darkness fell very late on our bivouac and across the plain, on which it seemed we had hardly moved. On our dust-covered faces and aching muscles, we were already asleep on our feet. The silence seemed to have a special quality, as though it had come from the end of the world. At daybreak, our march resumed. For hours, the long row of hills on the horizon seemed to remain at the same distance from us. We were walking through a rocky plain where the highest rise in the ground was scarcely the height of a man. Small stands of trees, which reminded me of photographs of Africa, were scattered across the landscape. The trees were short and scrubby, curiously like the trees of high altitudes. The wind blew the red dust everywhere, as if we were tramping through a universe of powdered brick. For a long time now we had given up marching in threes, the regulation order for marching troops, in favor of the system used by partisans. We were broken up into more or less compact groups, in which a man was ahead only until someone else caught up with him. Everyone was tired, and our pace was slackening. We had given up all unnecessary conversations, keeping all our breath and strength to continue putting one foot in front of the other. How many thousands of steps did we still have to take? Our boots, the color of the dusty universe, kept on across the rocky plain, which seemed to be leading us nowhere. The light wind filled our long, unkempt hair with dust. Our position in relation to certain reference points on the horizon seemed unchanging, and the rhythm of our steps, the sounds of our progress, and the wind itself became overwhelmingly monotonous. From time to time we could hear a rumble from the great hollow of emptiness which filled our stomachs. Just after the 11 o'clock halt, during which we consumed the last of our millet, an incident disturbed the general monotony. 2 twin-engine planes, which we had fortunately been able to see a long way off, appeared in the hot blue sky. The horizon was so vast that anything which crossed it was visible for at least 5 minutes before it reached us. We scattered as usual and assumed a position of anti-aircraft defense. Some of us were going to die. The planes were either light bombers or reconnaissance planes, but unmistakably Russian. The 2 planes flew over us at an altitude of about 1,500 feet. The snore of their engines pierced the gentle breeze and seemed to echo in the depths of our tense stomachs. The 2 Popovs took our fire without sending down anything in return. They flew in a large circle which we followed with anguished eyes. The second time around they would surely let us have it. However, their second swoop produced nothing but a swarm of white butterflies, flashing and fluttering against the blue of the sky. As soon as the planes were gone, some of our men went out to pick up the leaflets. A fellow came over to me waving a dozen. Ivan doesn't seem to understand if we can't eat, we can't crap. He's gone and sent us a lot of paper. We read the communist tracts. German soldiers, you have been betrayed. Surrender to our units, which will rehabilitate you. You have lost the war. Then, to raise our morale, we were shown some bad photographs of anonymous ruins, which, it was claimed, were German cities flattened by bombs. Also, there were photographs of smiling German prisoners. Under each of these photographs was a short caption, "Comrades, the temporary captivity which we are experiencing in no way resembles the lies we were led to believe. We have been agreeably surprised by the kindness of the camp officers. When we think of you, comrades, wading through the slime of the trenches to preserve the capitalist world, we cannot advise you strongly enough to lay down your arms." And so it went on. One fellow who had managed to escape from Tambov was shouting with rage, "The bastards! For all I know, I'm the only survivor from that damn place." In disgust, he tore the leaflet to shreds and scattered it into the wind. We resumed our march. The leaflets were still circulating from hand to hand, and their words and phrases, "The war is lost," "treason," "cities destroyed," echoed in our minds like a gloomy round. Of course, it was communist propaganda. All we had to do was talk to the fellow who'd escaped from Tambov to understand that. But then anyone who'd been home on leave had seen the bombed German cities. And then there was our continuous and painful retreat and our daily existence with its total lack of transport, gas, food, mail, everything. Perhaps the war really was lost, but that couldn't be possible. Here we were walking across the Russian plain. Was it still ours, or was it simply witnessing our slow death? But that too was impossible. We had to dismiss these black thoughts. We were simply living through a difficult period which was bound to pass. Tomorrow surely we would get some supplies, and everything would once more make some kind of sense. We had to shake our heads and dispel our dark reveries. Today the sun was shining and we had to press on. We began to sing one of our marching songs with deliberate vehemence. Auf der Heide blüht ein kleines Blümelein, und das heißt Erika, heiß von 100.000 kleinen Bienelein, wird umschwärmt Erika. This was the second time Hals had shaken me awake. Despite the exhaustion which rapidly returned us to unconsciousness, it was annoying to be torn from such deep sleep. "I'm telling you, I can hear guns," he said. I listened, but was aware of nothing except the pale, glittering night. "Leave me alone, Hals, for the love of God. Don't wake me for anything. We'll be marching again tomorrow, and I'm so tired I could die." "I'm telling you that off and on we can hear guns. If you'll look around, you'll see that other fellows are standing up and listening too." I listened again, but still heard nothing except the gently blowing wind. "Well, it's possible, but so what? This isn't the first time. Go back to sleep. You'll be better off." "I can't sleep on an empty stomach. I'm sick of this. I've got to find something to eat." "So that's why you wake me up?" Someone walked over to us. It was Schlesser, who was on guard duty. "Did you hear that, fellows? Guns." "That's what I was trying to tell this blockhead," said Hals, nudging me. Despite the sleep stagnating in me so that I was only half conscious, I felt obliged to listen to what my companion was saying. "All we need here is a Soviet breakthrough," Schlesser said. "That would be the end of us," said Hals, his voice suddenly hoarse. "We can still fight, though," said someone else who'd just come up. "Fight," said Hals, hideously objective. "With what? 700 or 800 anemic, half-starved men armed with light infantry weapons. You must be joking. It would be the end of us, I tell you. We haven't even got the strength to run." But the newcomer wasn't joking. His name was Kellerman. Although he was exactly 20 years old, he already had the lucidity of a much older man and an instant grasp of reality. This reality lifted the veil of fear and exposed the anguish deeply inscribed on his face, whose hardened features seemed incompatible with his youth. Then we all heard a distant rumble, carried to us on the wind. We stared at each other. The noise stopped, began again, stopped again. Artillery, said Schlesser. The rest of us were silent. I had heard the noise, like everyone else, but my exhaustion had produced the sensation of two simultaneous lives. Sleep and reality had become confused. I felt as though I were deeply asleep, dreaming of artillery fire, lost somewhere in time. My comrades went right on talking. I listened to them without really hearing what they were saying. Sergeant Sperlovsky had joined us and seemed to be making some deductions. It's still far off, he said, but it's the front. We'll be arriving in a day, or a day and a half. That would be an hour or two in a car, Howells remarked. Sperlovsky looked at him. In a hurry? So sorry we're not motorized anymore. That's not what I meant, Howells growled. I was thinking of Ivan, who must have gas and tanks. If he breaks through, he could be on top of us just like that. Sperlovsky stalked off without another word. What business had he to be discouraged? A non-com in the Gross Deutschland. Let's go to sleep, Kellerman said. There's nothing better to do. It's a nice lookout, I couldn't help saying. Here we are like animals in a slaughterhouse waiting for dawn when the butchers will come. Are we going to be killed with empty stomachs? Halls roared. Despite our hunger and fear, we managed to fall asleep again and stayed asleep until daybreak, which arrived at what would be considered the middle of the night in any organized civilian life. Here we had no bells or bugles or even a whistle. The gentle commotion made by our group leaders was enough to drag us from the heavy sleep, which paradoxically was very easily penetrated by sound and movement. According to the custom of troops approaching a combat zone, movement at night or before full daylight was preferred. The docile Wehrmacht, even in its death agony, clung to its professionalism and woke its soldiers at the customary hour, leading them in disciplined order to the field of glory. The rules did not envisage that soldiers without food could avoid this or that trial, but stated that in all cases, everything still possible should be accomplished with maximum efficiency. Time is measured out in equal quantities for the poor and the old and the underfed alike. Our faded uniforms looked gray in the first faintly white light of day. Familiar silhouettes which had walked beside me for nearly 2 years now were advancing on either side of me in a rhythm that was also mine and that has remained indelibly stamped on my memory. Whenever I think of those days, I can see again with absolute clarity details which are pointless in themselves, familiar profiles in a diffused light, the loose cloth of trousers improperly tucked into boots, belts loosened by their dangling load of heavy objects, and helmets hanging from one of our straps, always knocking against some other metallic object, with a dull sound I can still hear, without resonance like a padded bell. And the smells and the backs, hunched over in 1,000 different ways, each one with its own expression and its own arrangement of creases. The very anonymity of our uniforms created its own kind of individuality. No one uniform was precisely like any other, although no other uniform is so deliberately designed as the German to turn a man into a soldier, absolute and united with his fellows, and not just a civilian in special clothes. For the rest of the world, there are German soldiers with no distinction between them, but for us, the word Kamerad, meaning one soldier just like any other, was exaggerated. Beyond the uniform and the formula, we were individuals. That back over there, the same color as thousands of others, is not just any back. It belongs to Schlesser, and over there, on the right, is Solma. Somewhat closer, that's Lenzen and his helmet. It's his helmet, unlike any other among the hundreds of thousands issued in the same series. Then there are Prince and Hals and Lindbergh and Kellerman and Frosch, whom I'd recognize in any crowd. Through our sameness, our individualism emerged, as it must have from all men stripped to essentials since the beginning of time. All our helmets were the same gray-green, covered with dust, but none stayed for long at a regulation angle or moved in the same way, and all were distinctive and distinguishable. One thing above all remains more or less indescribable, the contagious anguish of soldiers stripped of everything, whom each step is carrying closer to an incomprehensible danger. There were also our resignation and our equally profound and violent desire to live. Apart from these three sentiments in common, everything else was personal. But this was apparent only to us. To anyone else, all Huns were alike. We saw them when we were still 500 yards away. They were swarming around the 3 or 4 vehicles which had stopped to wait for us. There must have been at least 10,000 of them. 10,000 men seems like nothing on the Ukrainian plain, but it is still a considerable number. 10 or 12,000 soldiers in a pitiful state, storming our wretched trucks, rummaging through them again and again in search of some food or medicine. They had thrown themselves onto our battered machines, as if they were revenging themselves for their abandonment. Then, as we arrived and they became aware of our miserable state, they collapsed into a torpor which was close to suicide. Those wretched men, collected from several infantry regiments, were retreating after several days of fighting an implacable enemy who had toyed with them, decimating them as and when he chose. They were on foot, in rags, their faces livid after so much suffering, dragging along with them nauseatingly wounded men on litters made of branches, like the litters of the Sioux. These men, numbed by too much disaster, were no longer fighting for any spiritual motive, but were more like wolves, terrified of starvation. To oppose their sole and legitimate reason for living was to risk one's own life. These men, who no longer distinguished between enemies and friends, were ready to commit murder for less than a quarter of a meal. They were to demonstrate this a few days later in a horrible phase of the confused flux of the war. These martyrs to hunger massacred 2 villages to carry off their supplies of food, but 30 of their men died of starvation anyway, near the Romanian frontier. Our shock at meeting combat troops in such a state was equal to theirs at finding us as we were. "Where do you think you're going?" sneered a tall, emaciated lieutenant, swimming in a curious conglomerate uniform which was far too big for him. He was talking to our lieutenant, who had led us since the death of Wes Radow. Our lieutenant pointed on the map to the position we were supposed to reach. He cited names, numbers, latitudes. The other listened, swaying stiffly like a dead tree in the wind. "What are you talking about? What sector? What hill? Are you dreaming? There's nothing left, nothing. Do you hear me? But mass graves which are blowing apart in the wind." The man talking like this still wore the 1935 commemorative National Socialist decoration pinned to his scorched tunic, which was marked by 1,000 stains. He was tall and dark, and a heavy bundle of grenades hung from his belt. "You can't be serious," our lieutenant answered in a pleading tone. "You've had a hard time, you're a little light in the head, and you're hungry. We, too, have been keeping ourselves alive by miracles." The other drew closer. His eyes were filled with such a hateful, disquieting light that we would gladly have killed him, as if he were a sick animal. "Yes, I'm hungry," he roared. "Hungry in a way the saints could never have imagined. I'm hungry, and I'm sick, and I'm afraid, to such a point that I want to live to revenge myself for all mankind. I feel like devouring you, Lieutenant. There were cases of cannibalism at Stalingrad, and soon there will be here, too." "You're crazy. If worst comes to worst, we can eat the grass, and there's all of occupied Russia, with plenty of reserves for the troops. For God's sake, pull yourself together. You keep going, and we'll cover your retreat." The other made a noise more like a hiccup than a laugh. "You'll cover us, and we can take ourselves quietly away. Tell that to the men you see there. They've been fighting for 5 months and have lost 4/5 of their comrades. They've been waiting for reinforcements, ammunition, vitamins, food, medicine, God knows what. They've hoped 1,000 times and survived 1,000 times. You won't be able to tell them anything, Lieutenant, but you can try." We tried to shift some of the materiel from our decrepit vehicles, the last vestige of our motorization, onto our backs, to make room for some of the seriously wounded men among the retreating troops. They left first, driving past the rest of us, who were left to that extent less mobile than before on the great Ukrainian plain. We watched the trucks disappearing into the distance, envying the fate of the wounded, who might be going to escape the oppression of that immensity. Then our motley collection of troops continued their retreat, a vain and empty march. We seemed to be tramping along a huge carpet on rollers, which unwound beneath our feet, leaving us always in the same place. How many hours and days and nights went by, I can no longer remember. Our groups spread out and separated. Some stayed where they were and slept. No order or threat was strong enough to move them. Others, small groups of men who were particularly strong or who still had enough food to keep going, went on ahead. There were also many suicides. I remember 2 villages stripped of every scrap of food and more than one massacre. Men were ready to commit murder for a quart of goat's milk, a few potatoes, a pound of millet. Starving wolves on the run don't have time to stop and talk. There were still a few human beings left in the wolf pack, soldiers who died to save a can of sour milk, the last reserve of a pair of infants. Others died at the hands of their fellows for protesting against the savagery produced by famine, or were beaten to death because they were suspected of hiding food. Usually these men were found to have nothing. There were a few exceptions. An Austrian had his head kicked in, and a few handfuls of crumbled vitamin biscuit were found at the bottom of his sack. He had probably collected them by shaking out the provision sacks of some commissariat, which had ceased to exist several weeks before. Men died for very little, for the possibility of a day's food. When everything had been eaten, down to the last sprout in the meager gardens, 12,000 soldiers stared at the village, which had been abandoned by its terrified inhabitants. Living corpses wandered here and there, staring at the tragic shreds of existence which remained to them. They stared at the scene of pillage, looking for some understanding of the past, which might shed some light on the future. They stayed where they were until dusk. Then 3 or 4 armored cars from the advancing Russian troops arrived, peppered the crowd of men, who didn't even try to escape, with machine gun fire, made a half-turn, and left. The desperate, ravening men scattered across the steppe. Everyone fled running for the west because the west drew them irresistibly as the north attracts the needle of a compass. The steppe absorbed and obliterated them, leaving only small, scattered groups tramping toward the Romanian frontier, which was very close but still out of sight. I belonged to one such group. There were 9 of us, Hals and me, inseparable as always, Sperlovsky, Frosch, Prince, an older fellow called Siemenleish, who must have been an incorruptible civil servant before the war, and 3 Hungarians, with whom all conversation was impossible. Were they volunteers, or had they been enrolled in circumstances similar to mine? No one knew. They looked at us with eyes full of hate, as if we were responsible for the misadventure of the Third Reich in which they had been involved, yet they clung to us as if we were their last hope of ever returning to their distant firesides. One day there was a line of trees or a hedge of saplings which I can still see as in a drunken dream, and beyond it, the wide, very wide field which we planned to cross. We could see some buildings on the crest of a small hill and had decided to search them for food. Halfway across the field, the sound of planes made us look up. 2 fighter bombers were seeking some prey. 7 of us melted into that enormous stretch of ground, and 2 ran, Frosch and myself. Like hunted animals intent on self-preservation, each man thought only of himself, and no one shouted to us. The 2 Russian aviators spotted our wild gallop and dived down at us. Although we had nothing left but our skins, we still represented the enemy to them and had to be wiped out. When the noise reached a certain pitch, we instinctively threw ourselves down on the thick grass. The bullets passed over our heads and landed far beyond us. When we lifted our heads, we could see the planes completing a graceful arabesque against the stormy blue and black summer sky. Gasping for breath, we ran desperately until the 2 vultures once again filled the air with overwhelming noise. The planes made 2 more passes after that, peppering the ground with bullets, each time 20 or 30 yards wide of the mark. Like a terrible joke, the planes roared down a 4th time at the trembling, sweating grasshoppers which were ourselves. Suddenly, as if by a miracle, we came to a ditch and fell into it. Without seeing them, we distinctly heard the roar of the Russian rockets, which turned both banks of our ditch into ridges of broken earth. Our friends were sure we were dead. The planes made 1 more pass and flew off, undoubtedly convinced that they had brought our wanderings to an end. When we walked out through the whirling dust, Our companions greeted us with shouts of incredulous delight. At the farm, which the inhabitants had abandoned some 15 minutes before our arrival, we found a kettle full of steaming Jerusalem artichokes, which had undoubtedly been left to distract us. We went on our way, gorging on this unexpected windfall. 2 days later, during which we twice collected potatoes from Russians at gunpoint, we ran into an interminable convoy retreating into Romania and were inescapably absorbed into it. Then we experienced Romania and its population, which seemed stunned by the sequence of events, by the rout of their army, and by the painful disintegration of the Wehrmacht. Civilian life was in a state of panic, with Romanian and foreign partisans, daily overflights of foreign planes, raids for food and supplies, and Romanian prostitutes who flocked around the troops in such numbers that it seemed as if most of the women in Romania must be prostitutes. We marched 20, 25, even 30 miles a day, pouring with sweat and stunned by disillusion. Our tortured feet were alternately bare in the dust of narrow, twisting roads, then back in our boots, and then naked and bleeding once more. Our hollow stomachs rumbled with hunger. There were raiding parties, reformation of units, and a lunatic rabble whose fringes and surface were skimmed by military police intent on discipline and, as always, alert for the possibility of exemplary executions. The landscape was profoundly romantic, but we had been transformed into ravening wolves and thought of nothing but food. A particular episode emerges from my memories of disorder, a tragic paroxysm which still seems to me a symbol of humanity gone mad. We were in the mountains and had just been through a town called Regan, which at that time was known as Arlau or Erlau. We were tramping along, gray with dust and pouring with sweat. We had miraculously escaped incorporation into several scratch formations, and our interminable wretched column was twisting through what seemed like an infinite chain of mountains. The column was broken up into groups of varying size, in which unkempt soldiers pushed along every kind of transport to move our basic necessities. We requisitioned the most extraordinary vehicles. Anyone who found a bicycle grabbed it, even if it had no tires, and went on ahead of the rest to skim off anything even remotely digestible. In this district of jagged peaks and crags, we were free of enemy aircraft, but the terrain was ideal for partisans, and there were many battles to the death between them and our men, who were now fighting simply to save their skins. In this district, one group among many others of men in a motley conglomeration of clothes was struggling to reach the mother country. Behind our glittering eyes, deeply sunk into shadowy sockets, one belief sustained us. This was that, if we managed to survive, the mother country would receive us with tenderness and try to help us forget the unimaginable trial which was nearly over. We thought that once we reached home, the war would be over, and that in the worst imaginable case, the army would be reorganized so that no enemy would enter Germany itself. We held to this as the one final idea which would justify our sufferings and banish the solution of suicide which others had already accepted. Yesterday's Lancer, members of elite units, Panzer Grenadiers who had confronted 1,000 deaths to live for a chimera, clung to the idea that we had to live to be able to hope, and we had to hope passionately to be able to live as we were. We had to fight against daily ambush and keep going no matter what, to get away from the Russians who were hard on our heels, and we had to eat a certain minimum, which wasn't easy to do. There were 12 in our group, many of them familiar companions, Schlesser, Frosch, Lieutenant Wollers, Lenzen, Kellerman, and then Hals and me, kept together by a miracle of silent fraternity. Hals, who had grown startlingly thin, was forcing his large bony body along the narrow mountain road some 4 or 5 yards ahead of me. He often walked ahead of me, which gave me a certain sense of security, although his large body was seriously reduced. He was stripped to the waist, wearing a leather belt and a band of cartridges for the Spandau across his chest. A Russian blouse, in anticipation of the cool evenings at this altitude, floated from the leather pouch that held his few possessions, along with 4 or 5 grenades. His heavy steel helmet seemed to be riveted to his head, and the lice in his filthy hair must have died for lack of light. Many men had thrown away their heavy helmets, but Hals felt his was a last link with the German army, and that during this terrible trial we should try to remain soldiers rather than degenerate into tramps. I kept mine too as a sign of solidarity dangling from my belt. Someone up ahead shouted for us to come and see. We looked down into a leafy ravine. A camouflage truck bearing the inscription WH had crashed to the bottom. Lenzen was already running down to have a closer look. "Watch out!" someone shouted. "It might be a trap." Lieutenant Wohlers had joined Lenzen. We drew back, certain that the partisans had arranged a booby trap and that we would see our two companions blown to pieces any minute. However, a reassuring shout floated up from the gulf. "A windfall! Mein Gott, it's like a whole commissary!" Within seconds, we were all running toward the miracle. "Look at that! Chocolates, cigarettes, Wurst! Good God, and here are 3 bottles, too." "Shut up," shouted Schlesser, "or you'll have the whole army down here. It's a miracle no one found this before." "So many delicious things," said Frosch in an almost tender voice. "Let's all grab everything we can. We can share it out later on the road." Frosch and another fellow loaded themselves heavily and climbed back to the road to keep watch. Thousands of men were wandering very close to us. We would try to take everything. We had almost completed the job when our 2 lookouts shouted, "Achtung!" We ran into the brush and heard the distant roar of a motorcycle. The engine slowed down and seemed to stop. We ran off through the thorny growth, clutching our precious cargoes. We were used to getting out of the way in a hurry and melting into the ground. When an unfriendly eye might become too interested in our existence, we could hear some non-commissioned officers shouting and suppose that our 2 companions had been caught by a military patrol, perhaps even by the military police. "Those 2 sods were caught with bottles under their arms," muttered Wohlers. "Let's get out of here as fast as we can," said Lindbergh, who had just run up. "Someone's coming down," whispered Lenzen. "A military policeman, I saw his badge." "Hell, let's get out of here." Everybody ran, scattering into the bushes as if Ivan himself were at his heels. We regrouped after 500 or 600 yards, hiding behind a rocky outcrop. "I've lost enough breath because of those bastards," said Halls. "If they want to chase us this far, I'll take care of them." "You're crazy," said Lindbergh. "Don't talk like that. What are you trying to do to us?" "Shut up," Halls said. "You'll never make it home anyway. Ivan's going to get you for sure. Why don't you think for a minute of Frosch and the other fellow who've been caught?" "We might as well eat," said Wohlers. "I've had enough of giving orders and sweating and shitting in my pants like a baby when I'm scared, so let's get started. If we're going to die for it, all the more reason to fill our bellies while we can." Like hungry beasts, we wolfed down the contents of the tins and the other provisions, masticating loudly. "We'd better eat it all," Lenzen said. "If we're caught with anything in our sacks that wasn't handed out, we'll be in trouble." "You're right, let's eat it all. They won't slit us open to see what's inside, although it would be just like those bastards to check our shit." For an hour, we gorged ourselves until we were almost sick. When it grew dark, we returned to the road by a devious route. Lenzen stepped out of the brush first. "Come on, the coast is clear." We went on for 300 or 400 yards, passing once again the hole with its unexpected windfall, which had allowed us to fill our famished stomachs for a moment. There was no one in sight. We went on for another 2 or 3 miles and collapsed at the side of the road. "I can't go any farther," said Schlesser. "We're not used to eating anymore, and this is what happens." "Okay. Why don't we go to sleep right here?" someone said. "That will help our digestion." Toward 2 o'clock in the morning, a large group of German soldiers came by and woke us up. "On your feet!" shouted an old Feldwebel. "Get going, or Ivan will be in Berlin before you." We resumed our trek. This bunch had collected several horse-drawn wagons, and for a while we were able to ride. At daybreak, we arrived at a town built on the mountainside. Some men were splashing in an icy bathing place. Others were sleeping on the ground or on terrace walls. Farther on, still others had begun their march again, toward safety, the West, the mother country, waiting to receive them, whose true condition they couldn't begin to guess. And then there was a tree, a majestic tree, whose branches seemed to be supporting the sky. 2 sacks were dangling from those branches, 2 empty scarecrows swinging in the wind, suspended by 2 short lengths of rope. We walked under them and saw the gray, bloodless faces of hanged men and recognized our wretched friend Frosch and his companion. Don't worry, Frosch, whispered Halls. We ate it all. Lindbergh hid his face in his hands and wept. I managed with difficulty to read the message scribbled on the sign tied to Frosch's broken neck. I am a thief and a traitor to my country. A short way off, some 10 policemen in regulation uniform were standing beside a sidecar and a Volkswagen. As we walked by them, our eyes met theirs. That concludes the 34th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.